Good evening and welcome to the Modern Japanese History Association New Book Series, our December meeting. I'm delighted to introduce to you tonight's speaker, which is Professor Bill Steele, Professor Emeritus at International Christian University in Japan. And as our discussant, we are pleased to have Professor Robert Hellyer of Wake Forest University in conversation with Professor Steele. So the timeline for the way things will work tonight is we will have about 40 minutes divided between Professor Steele's introduction of the book, which is, of course, Rethinking Japan's Modernity, which came out last year, 2024, from Harvard University Asia Center Press. And from Harvard University Asia Center Press. And so Bill will talk about that. Then we will have Professor Hellyer, we'll have Rob provide some questions for a kind of conversation about the book. So those two parts should last about 40 minutes, after which time we will then move to a question and answer series from the audience. So I do encourage you to ask questions for the Q&A, which should begin around 10 minutes to 9 or 9, thereabouts. So please have those in mind to ask, and you can do that one of two ways, either by posting a question to the chat, which I will be happy to read. Alternately, you can raise your hand and give the question in your own voice, but please do be sure to unmute yourself before you do so. And I will direct the order of questioners. So let me begin then by introducing myself, which I seem not to have done. Emer O'Dwyer. I teach at Oberlin College, Japanese history, and it is truly a pleasure to for me to be able to bring this book to the attention of the Modern Japanese History New Book Series. I think it's fabulous. I have long been a fan of Professor Steele's work and his great contribution to translating documents for classroom use. I've been using his work just today, in fact, in class. So let me give Professor Steele a proper introduction. He is Professor Emeritus of Japanese History at International Christian University in Tokyo, where he taught for an astonishing 37 years, if my math is right, from 1981 to 2018. And also in terms of extraordinary facts, given the longevity and indeed vitality of his scholarship to the present moment, he received his PhD from Harvard in History and East Asian Languages in 1976, which is 49 years ago. So this is really quite something, and I am in great admiration of, again, the quality and longevity of his work in the classroom and as a scholar. So just to very briefly introduce some of his very many publications, which have been written both in English and Japanese, in addition to tonight's book, which you will hear much more about. Recently, he has had a book called The Heart of Mingei, which was translated by Yuasa Hachiro. And that came out in Japanese and English in 2023. He has also, as you will find out, written extensively on the Meiji Restoration, with a piece published in Japanese in 2019 entitled Meiji Isshin to Kindai Nihon no Atarashii Mikata, or New Views on Japan's Meiji Restoration and the Modern Transition. In 2017, he and Ann Walthall co-authored a book that, as I said earlier, I use regularly for my own survey of early modern Japanese history, and that is Politics and Society in Japan's Meiji Restoration, a short history with documents. He's also, as I read through his CV, done all sorts of co-authorships and co-editing, and I've just chosen one or two that caught my eye. Japan and Russia, 3 Centuries of Mutual Images, was published in 2008 with a co-author, Yulia Mikhailova. Then we also had another star publication, Alternative Narratives in Modern Japanese History, from way back 2003. Recent articles, again, very briefly, one out last year in Asian Cultural Studies entitled Japan's Paper and Pulp Industries in the 1930s, Where Did All the Wood Come From? An article also in Asian Cultural Studies in 2019, The Man Who Walked 40 Million Steps, Ino Tadataka and the Modern Mapping of Japan. And one that I'm particularly excited to read, also from 2019, published in a book out of Leiden from Brill Publishers, a volume called Invisible Bicycle, Parallel Histories and Different Timelines, an article entitled Betting on the Wheel, The Bicycle and Japan's Post-War Recovery, which sounds fabulous. So with that, and there are many more publications besides. So that is our brief introduction to Professor Steele's career and work. Let me quickly also introduce Professor Rob Hellyer, who is a professor of history at Wake Forest University, North Carolina, a historian of early modern and modern Japan. Professor Hellyer has explored topics in Japanese history from the 17th through the 20th centuries in several books and numerous articles. His most recent monograph, Green Tea with Milk and Sugar, When Japan Filled America's Teacups, was published by Columbia University Press in 2021. The Japanese translation of the book, Umi o Koeta Japan Tea, Ryokucha no Nichibei Koekishi to Cha Shonin Tachi, was published by Harashobo in 2022. So with that introduction, I turn things over to Professor Steele, and we are going to share the screen here for the presentation. So I'll get that started. Please, Professor Steele.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody from Japan. And thank you, Emer, for your very kind introduction, and Rob also for your comments coming up. And I'm happy to see so many familiar and friendly faces out there. Thank you for joining the discussion. I'm happy to introduce my book, Rethinking Japan's Modernity, which was mentioned earlier, published last year from the Asia Center at Harvard University. And as you can probably imagine, it was my COVID project. All 13 stories in the book had their first airing in the classroom at ICU over, you said 37 years, it seems even longer to me, at ICU in the form of lectures and readings that I gave to complement and sometimes to contradict the general textbook that we used. And many of my students were Japanese, and so I also aiming to make them think twice about what they learned in Japanese high school. My goal as a teacher and as a researcher is to mess things up a little bit, to provide different points of view. And so let me give you a few examples. The next slide here, when discussing Japan's modernization, I also include stories of anti-modernization. Chapter 6 of the book is a translation of Mantei Ōga's parody of Fukuzawa's Gakumon no Susume, the encouragement of learning. And the parody, Mantei Ōga's parody, is titled Gakumon Suzume, the sparrows in front of the school gate. And the Eastern sparrows immediately object to Fukuzawa's famous opening lines. They say, no, heaven does not create people above or below each other. Where is there any sign of equality in society today? Everywhere the rich and powerful tower over the weak and poor. Well, between 1872 and 1876, Mantei Ōga published a remarkable series of 30 booklets that poked holes in arguments that sought to transform Japan into a Western-style country. Yeah, and in fact, in the early 1870s, it saw considerable. It was a period when Japan is supposed to be westernizing rapidly. It's also a period of considerable debate for and against westernization or modernization. But sadly, Fukuzawa's critics have almost been forgotten. Well, no more, I hope. The next slide chapter goes into the contest between things native and foreign. And it's from chapter 5, which focuses on a anti-Western thinker and activist, Sada Kaiseki, and his Japan First policies. Now, while Mantei Ōga took aim at the introduction of Western ideas, Sada Kaiseki campaigned against the introduction of Western or foreign goods into Japan. His movement was called the Hakuraihin Haiseki Undo. And as you can see from the 1873 print here by Yoshifuji, the early Meiji period was a battleground between supporters of tradition and change. There is the Western umbrella and the Japanese umbrella fighting at the kago and the jinriksha, the Western style lamps and with kerosene, and the Japanese lamps up on the top left corner there with fish oil or with rapeseed oil, and there's oil. So these kind of contests were going on continuing. It shows this early 1870s as a period of contest rather than somehow taking in everything so quickly from the West. The next slide is on Sada Kaiseki's opposition movement. It drew widespread attention in the 1870s and in the 1880s, especially since he used economic rather than racial or cultural arguments. He used the new public media, especially newspapers, to get his point across. And here in this sort of a parody of a sumo wrestling match game sheet here, in his Baka no Bansuke, the ranking of fools, he noted, there are many different types of fools in this world, but there's no greater fool than the one who fails to use domestic products and instead demands the use of imports. Their actions cause, day by day and month by month, an increase in the amount of capital flowing out of the country and will lead the country to ruin. For the highest ranking wrestlers, or fools, were the ozeki of each division. In the East, there's the person who turns down rice and other grains and instead professes a love of bread. In the West, it's the person who gives up using domestically produced rapeseed oil or fish oil and instead depends on imported coal oil or kerosene for lighting. Now, to the next slide, this also, this is from chapter 9, which is When East and West Meet, and focuses on the Mingei movement. It shows that the Meiji period was also an age of nostalgia, of fondly looking back, but also with concern at a disappearing past. Of course, there were those who were eager to tear down the old, but there were also many who objected. Antiquarians such as Matsuura Takeshiro used the preservation of historic treasures in landscape and buildings. Museums and archives were built in the 1870s and 1880s, and in the can go back to the slide on Matsuura. Yeah, stay there for a bit. Thanks. In the 1880s, Okakura Kakuzo participated in a project to identify and preserve Japan's national treasures. Others began to collect and preserve craft industries that were rapidly falling victim to machine civilization. Okakura's Book of Tea, published in 1905, when the Russo-Japanese War was underway, asked the question, are we to be considered civilized only when we begin to commit wholesale slaughter on the Manchurian battlefields? What is civilization? Well, it's this other side of the coin that I want students to learn and add to their understanding of modern Japanese history. Now to the next slide, which in the introduction, I write that history is not one story, but many. So let's look at what happened in the year 1868. Instead of seeing 1868 as the starting point for Japan's rapid westernization, modernization, industrialization, military buildup, I use contemporary sources, especially satirical cartoons, fushiga, in an attempt to understand the experience of people at that time. When doing so, a very different story emerges. And chapter 4 is titled, That Terrible Year, 1868. Instead of the birth of modern Japan, the year 1868 for the Edo commoners was a year filled with bloodshed, dislocation, destruction, suffering, impoverishment. For the Edo commoners, the end of the world seemed to be at hand. Well, let me look at the satirical cartoon that's on the cover of the book. And you see it there. It's titled Shinsaku Ukiyo Dochu, On the Road to the Floating World. And like many other satirical cartoons, there's no indication of author or publisher or date. Fushiga, or satirical cartoons, were in a sense illegal publications. The breakdown of government controls allowed for a sort of free press. And from context, we can guess that this print was issued around the third month, 1868. The imperial army was advancing on Edo. Commoners were preparing for the worst. Many panicked and left the city carrying with them as many of their belongings as possible. The woodblock print depicts people at a crossroads, not knowing which way to turn, not knowing where to escape. One group has elected to remain behind and mute their worries with drink and dance. Another group heads into the mountains, taking their belongings with them, while others find themselves on a bridge, uncertain which way to go, forward or back. Certainly, this reflects the confusion and panic of many people at Edo at that time, confronted with the real possibility of death and destruction, literally the end of the world. And so this is the image on the cover of the book. And I'm really quite fond of that black cloud. You see it over there, Yamikumo. The Yamikumo that's hanging over Edo, in a sense also hanging over Japan. This, and in the distance, way up on the top, the left corner, is Mount Peaceful. Will anyone ever make it there? Probably not. Satirical prints also took advantage of a lot of word play. On the road to the floating world, ukiyo, the floating world, implies hope for a carefree world, but a different, also sounding the same, a different word that sounds the same, but with different Chinese characters, ukiyo. It's also there. Is this ukiyo dochu or ukiyo dochu? And this implies here, this transforms the future into a bleak and melancholy world on the road to a wretched world. And the readers would have their choice of which word they would use. The next slide, please. Over the course of 1 year, in a succession of hard-fought battles, the imperial army assumed control over most of Japan by about the 10th month or so. The city of Edo was renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital, and a new era name was announced from Keio 4 to Meiji 1. And in the 10th month, the young Emperor Meiji entered Tokyo. Here we see in this print, people bowed down as the emperor passed through the streets, and cheap woodblock prints like this one commemorated the event. This is Tokyo, Edo, Shinagawa, Takanawa no Fuke, the view of Tokyo, Edo, Shinagawa, and Takanawa by Utagawa Kuniteru, and it's dated the 10th month of 1868 and bears an official censorship seal. Control over the press and publications was by then largely in the hands of the new government. In contrast to the rowdy humor of earlier satirical cartoons, this woodblock print conveys a sense of tranquility, order, and pageantry, signaling an end to a year of bloody warfare. People bow to the invisible emperor inside, the palanquin that passes through. And in the distance, this rising sun blesses the event, and the local gods, shown in the upper right corner, welcome the emperor. But how true was the scene? In fact, this print was on sale before the actual event. It was an imagined and a sort of a piece of pro-imperial new government propaganda. Now let me show you a very different image of the coming out probably from the 10th month. In the next slide, here we see here that the underground press was still somewhat active. Around the same time that the anonymous, this is an anonymous print issued with a very different message. It shows the year 1868 as apocalypse. The depiction of death and disruption has few rivals. The mangled corpse of the last Tokugawa shogun lies on top of bodies. And the next slide, we can get a close-up of that. There you can see the Tokugawa is identified by the fellow in the center lying dead with his head thrown up with a kimono that looks like a brick pattern, blue bricks and blue and white brick pattern. Actually, those are numbers of ichis, ones, one. That's Hitotsubashi Yoshinobu, the last shogun there. And the mangled corpse of the last shogun lies on a pile of bodies. The horrific scene raises the question of the title, Shinkei Hoseki. Now, if I go back to the original slide here, you can see that I've given here two readings of that slide. This word can be translated as Chronicle of the World of Divine Grace. It doesn't seem to be what the picture is intended by the actual, what's shown in the print itself. So when word plays and homophones are taken into consideration, the title becomes also Shinkei Hoseiji, same pronunciation, but this time meaning a true portrait of a disintegrating world. So what happened in 1868? The beginning of modern Japan, or a terrible year for the people of Edo, or for all of Japan? Well, this is one of many stories that can be told about the Meiji Restoration. I'm not saying that this is a better or more accurate story, but it does make students think. And that's what I want students to do. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Bill, for giving us an overview of this terrific book. And it's really my distinct pleasure to be able to act as a discussant for the book. And you've covered so much over 80 years of Japanese history. But for me, some of the takeaways and some of the larger themes that I found after reading the book was number one, that you had engagements, particularly with the United States. And, in the short time we have here, you couldn't talk about the initial chapter of the book that talks about the perspective from San Francisco in the 1850s on the events that are unfolding in Japan. And also U.S. help for the Tohoku famine that hit it was in 1910s. Something event that I was not aware of. You also have in the later chapters a view of Kunitake's perspectives on being on the Iwakura mission, and then also his looking back at the events of the Meiji period. And another theme that I certainly, a larger takeaway that I had after reading the book was the bottom-up views of the Meiji Restoration, which of course you've offered us in your scholarship in the past. But for example, a chronicle written in the Kai period, which explores the example of the breakdown of law and order in the lead up to the Meiji Restoration, the economic challenges of commoners, and the natural disasters. And as the book, another excellent thing about the book is how you're giving us so many illustrations. You're using the prints and others that you've collected to help talk about, for example, the fear that gripped Edo at the end of the Boshin War, some of the things that you just talked about in your presentation. And I think also that you give us a real good sense of key individuals who were chronicling and assessing the Meiji Restoration and importantly, the following reforms. And we have this here from Katsukaishu. We have also Fukuzawa and Kume, who I just mentioned, and also the critique of Fukuzawa from Mantei Ōga, which you outlined in the presentation. Another takeaway that I certainly had was how challenges and also historicizing modernity. And you mentioned here Sada Kaiseki, challenging imported goods, but also perspectives on the development of Mingei and a sense of disappointment with the Meiji reforms. We have key figures involved in the Meiji Restoration and others looking back in the early 20th century and saying that in 1868 we thought that this would be going in a different course, and some real disappointment with that. Finally, you also keep for us in mind that disasters are always a part of the Japanese experience, with the Tohoku famine, but also then on the Kanto earthquake in 1923. So another larger point, another takeaway that you have given the book is that history is never assured, of course, reminding us of that point, but also the crossroads are key. And just as you outlined in the presentation, in 1868, for the people of Edo, there was a lot of uncertainty, to say the least, about what the new Satsuma Choshu regime would bring. So, and just to note that you have here, you mentioned 13 stories. And I just want to say it was an inspiration to me that you outlined the introduction in so many of those chapters and talked about how you'd done a presentation about this in the past. But as you said, this was a COVID book, so a chance for you to finish off these points here and finish off the stories, if you will, that you had already started to explore. And also just for everybody here that if I can recommend this book as a great one for teaching, because you've given us so many nice compact stories. And sadly, as we know now, it's harder, at least in my case, to assign longer works in my classes. So the chapters that you have in the book are perfectly in the length for an undergraduate classroom. And so much is covered in each one of those 13 stories that you give us. So I'd just like to ask a few broader questions as a way to get the discussion going and before we move into questions from the audience. And one that I had for you, Bill, was after extensively researching the Meiji Restoration, is it best to see Tokugawa and Meiji leaders as flexible or opportunistic?
Okay. Do I answer that now? Yes. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. And thanks for outlining the chapters of the book so nicely. There's a lot there, and actually, I did really hope that this is, of course, you can read it through, but it's available, I think, through some platforms that you can just download chapter by chapter. And I really hoping that this is wanting to make this useful in classrooms. So I've used these stories, and they're really good in encouraging discussion. Well, about you said flexibility. Yes, the Tokugawa or the Meiji leaders were able to change their behavior their thinking, and yes, to opportunistic too, in the sense that some people exploited immediate opportunities with an eye to personal profit, personal advantage, but also to maybe public advantage as well. Well, let me just focus on what you mean by flexibility. I immediately think back to when to Sakuma Shozan's statement that he said Eastern ethics and threats from outside, Eastern ethics and Western techniques. And that formula that he came up actually in the 1840s, before Perry, how to save Japan from an impending sense of, Naiyu Gaikan. There's going to be threats from without and threats from within. What's the threat? And his idea was somehow to combine East and West, Eastern ethics and Western techniques. He was a student of Rangaku, but he was also a student of Confucianism and of ancient Chinese texts, particularly the I Ching. And so actually this formula of opening the country to the West and Western techniques, he attributed this formula to a hexagram in the Book of Changes. So here you have a person who is going to say, let's open the country on the basis that he's using an ancient Chinese text. And I think that shows a little flexibility there. Well, another kind of person that comes to mind is actually Yoshida Shoin, who has his slogan, Sono Joy, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. We'd almost think this is a little bit like it's opposite to Eastern ethics and Western techniques. But as you know, in 1854, Yoshida Shoin was in Shimoda, and he tried to get on board one of Perry's ships. And I use this in my class a lot and say, well, why is he going to go and get on Perry? He's a nationalist, right? But in fact, he's not there to assassinate Perry, but to beg to be taken to America. He wanted to learn how America, a young country, had become so wealthy and so powerful in such a short time. So in a sense, he wanted to learn about the West, or learn from the West, in order to protect Japan from the West. So in this sense, I like this phrase that nationalism and internationalism are really two sides of the same coin. And as you know, the end of the story for Yoshida Shoin, so I won't go into that. Not a happy story there. Well, another example as a person I studied for my PhD would be Katsukaishu. He was able to secure the peaceful surrender of Edo Castle. He negotiated with Saigo Takamori, the leader of the Satsuma Choshu group, and in the midst of the Civil War. I think chapter 7 in the book looked at Katsukaishu, an older man, looking back at what he had done when he was young, looking back on the restoration. But when he looked back at, he declared the Meiji Restoration to be a smooth and peaceful transition of power brought about by negotiations. He really focused on the fact that he was negotiating with Saigo. Not negotiation by concessions, by sacrifice on both sides. And he emphasized that restraint on both sides cut short the Civil War and laid the foundations for national unity and cooperation between the old regime and the new regime. And so, in his own life, he was in the late 1860s, he was head of the Bakufu Army and Navy. He was commander-in-chief. But then he goes on into the new government to serve the new government as a high-ranking official and as elder statesman. And so it's a very flexible career as well, to be able to manage both. But as a person who is able to really change his mind and point of view, perhaps there's no greater person than Fukuzawa Yukichi. You might think so. Yeah. But in the 1860s, he was a staunch supporter of the Tokugawa shogunate. And in chapter 3 of the book, looks at a translation of his 1866 petition to crush Choshu, create a new centralized form of government under the Tokugawa. In the 1870s, he's known for his Gakumon no Susume, for an advocacy of Western learning, of individualism. But from the mid-1880s, he becomes known as a supporter of Japanese expansionism in Asia. And then in 1891, he becomes very critical of Katsukaishu and Enomoto Takeaki for surrendering he looks back at the peaceful return of the castle that Katsuhao negotiated. Well, this act was an act of cowardness and sort of right. He should have fought to the end. And Enomoto, when he fought for a while, but then he surrendered. He didn't die fighting. And so he criticized them for their failing to fight to the bitter end. And at that time, he was arguing that Katsu, he said, and I translated his Yasegaman no Setsu, fighting to the bitter end. It's in the book there as a translation. And he said that actually what Katsu did by surrendering the castle was that he caused great damage to the Japanese warrior spirit, to Bushido. This is Fukuzawa in 1890s. So yes, leaders before and after 1868 were no strangers to flexibility, for better or worse. This flexibility and openness to change played a crucial role in the rapid introduction of things from the West. But at the same time, I think I also have to make one more little inclusion here. It wasn't just the elite. It was the commoners who also were also very flexible and actually very curious. The kind of all levels of Japanese society, you see curiosity and a desire to learn about the West. And I just go back to what I recall from the Perry mission, that one of the leaders there looked at, surprised at how many people came out to see them and they wanted to find out about the West. And the journalist said, the Japanese are the most curious and inquiring person next to a genuine Yankee in the world. Well, I think that maybe that's enough to about that question. Sorry, I went on a little bit too long.
No, thank you for expounding in different ways related to that question. And just to note that you talked about, you said chapter 3, where Fukuzawa is talking about the need to support the Tokugawa shogunate, and little details that you mentioned, how this document that was in the Keio archives, but not allowed to be viewed for many, many years because it was not to be seen that Fukuzawa was such an ardent supporter of the Tokugawa. And also just the fact that his last publication was this diatribe against Katsu and Enomoto Takaki. So this is just another one of the examples of the really interesting perspectives and details that you're presenting to us in this book. So if I could offer another question, as we compare the Meiji period to today, should we laud the Meiji leaders, be they governmental, intellectual, cultural, for their willingness to take risks and adopt new practices and institutions?
Okay, yeah. Well, I don't know about praising them, but certainly, I think actually at that time people didn't have much choice, but to take risks. And again, using showing extraordinary times mean extraordinary measures, or require extraordinary measures, and they took them. So that's that. I think we can take that as a given. They had risks to take, and they thought the country's survival was at risk. But at the same time, there were, I think that your question is really about Japanese people today. What they, maybe they have overlearned the lessons of acting recklessly. It's often pointed out people of Japan today have a strong desire to avoid risk, especially after the collapse of the bubble in the 1880s, early 1890s. So, yeah, maybe people have been reluctant to take on risks, and maybe looking back at the Meiji period is a good idea, especially starting new businesses, investment in the future, declining birth rate. All of this probably has to do with a lot of risk adversity. I mean, people don't want to take risks. And people have recognized this, and I think like the NHK dramas the last couple of years, either on Shibusawa, the an entrepreneur who founded 500 countries, or even now on Staya Jizaburo on the Berabo idea. Here's a young upstart who starts becomes an entrepreneur. He starts a media company, makes a lot of money, and also, there's this kind of encouragement from popular media, but I don't see any change. I think people still are fairly comfortable with being with stability rather than change. But what's going to happen, we don't know. It'll be interesting to see whether the formation of a new government now under Takeichi will, who seems to be more willing to take big chances for the future of Japan. It will be interesting to see if the LDP will usher in a new age of change and risk taking. But who knows? The future is often completely unknown.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I'd like to pose another question, and related to the title of the book, which is about modernity and Japan's modernity. So what is the most appropriate way, in your opinion, after writing this book and studying about the Japanese experience for so long, to define Japanese modernity in the Meiji and Taisho periods?
Oh, well, well, rethinking is the word I use, but actually, I guess I think the modernity is that in Japan and probably elsewhere in other parts of the world, especially from the 19th century on, is really kind of contested modernity, or maybe negotiated modernity, a hybrid modernity. These are kind of words that come to mind, and they describe what Japan's modernity and the modernity of many other countries who come to adapt and adopt new technologies from outside of their own culture. So I guess I would like negotiated, because I look at Katsukaishi's negotiations there, negotiated modernity. And I think that this also involves a lot of active engagement with so-called advanced ideas and technologies, and food, clothing, architecture, all these things coming from outside, but also looking at them actively, critically, picking and choosing, adopting, rejecting, rethinking, and a mixed, and actually what you end up in Japan's case is that indigenous traditions, indigenous culture and traditions survive, but are rethought, reinterpreted, and blended with global insights. So I guess that also the word hybrid comes to mind a lot. Japanese modernity is a kind of a hybrid society combining the best, maybe also the worst of both countries, but East and West. That sort of hybridity is, I think, marks Japan's modernity.